The cosmos had always been a vast, unknowable expanse, an ocean of stars stretching out to infinity. But within this unyielding darkness, there was a silence that had never been broken, until now. It started as a whisper, a signal, faint and fragile, like the dying breath of a civilization, a tremor in the fabric of space itself. It cut through the endless vacuum, carried by the vast, invisible web of gravitational waves that spanned the galaxy. The signal was broken, fragmented, but not beyond understanding. And it was old, far older than any known empire, a relic from a time long forgotten, buried beneath the rubble of centuries. The message echoed with an ancient fear. Help us. The end is coming. For weeks, the Galactic Concord, a coalition of countless advanced civilizations, dismissed it as the desperate cry of a dying race, too far lost in time and space to matter. After all, the Concord had received thousands of similar messages in the past. Distress calls from empires already reduced to dust, their pleas forever swallowed by the void. But this one felt different. There was something in it that reached beyond the usual desperation, a warning that cut to the core of every sentient being. The humans, with their ceaseless curiosity and optimism, were not like the others. They had long believed that peace was achievable among the stars, that understanding, empathy, and collaboration could bridge the vast gulfs of space. Where others saw only an ancient relic, they saw a lifeline, a chance to make a difference, a chance to do what no other race had dared to attempt, to answer the call and save those who had reached out, even if it meant risking everything. And so, with the full backing of their most powerful institutions, humanity sent forth its best and brightest. Emissaries, diplomats, scientists, and engineers rushed to decode the ancient transmission, following its coordinates to a forgotten star system on the very edge of known space. It had once been a thriving colony, an advanced civilization whose history was now only written in the stars. What they found when they arrived was not what they expected. The planet was a graveyard, but not in the way one would imagine. There were no bones, no bodies, no signs of civilization in the traditional sense. The world was barren, the landscape twisted and tortured. Towering spires of obsidian metal jutted from the cracked earth, their surfaces charred and mangled, as though some unimaginable force had twisted them with inhuman strength. The sky was an eerie, unnatural red, casting a sickly hue over the broken ruins. The ground beneath their boots was scorched, burnt to glass, reflecting the stars like a mirror of death. But what chilled the humans wasn't the destruction itself. It was the silence. There were no remnants of the people who had once called this place home. No signs of their civilization, no artifacts, no traces of life. No animals or plants. No sounds of wind or the hum of technology. There was only the stillness, the kind of stillness that gnawed at the mind and made the heart race, as if something was watching, waiting. They scoured the ruins for days, desperate for answers, but it was as if the planet itself had swallowed every trace of its former inhabitants. And then, deep beneath the surface, they found something. It was a bunker. The entrance was hidden beneath the wreckage, obscured by the remnants of what appeared to be a long-abandoned structure. They broke through the debris, their tools scraping against metal and stone, until they finally reached the vault doors. The air within was stale, untouched by time, and the team hesitated before entering. It felt wrong. This place wasn't supposed to be here, but duty bound them, and so they proceeded. Inside, they discovered the truth. Not just a warning, but the rest of the message, hidden, encrypted, waiting for someone to unlock it. The message wasn't just a plea for help. It was a prophecy, a nightmare left behind by those who had once lived here. The original message had been shattered, distorted, but now, as they decrypted the final words, the full horror of what had transpired was revealed. Do not answer. Do not come. It is not a distress call. It is a warning. We are already gone. And soon, so will you. The realization hit them like a freight train. The people who had sent the message weren't pleading for help. They were warning anyone who would listen. The galaxy had misinterpreted it. The destruction of this world hadn't been some isolated incident. It was the result of something far worse, something incomprehensible. The warning had not been for the aid of others. It had been for their survival. But it was too late. A deep sense of dread settled over the human team as they stared at the screen, their minds struggling to comprehend what they had just uncovered. This wasn't a simple attack. This wasn't just the fall of one world, but the beginning of something far more insidious, a cosmic plague, a curse from the very edges of the universe itself. And it was coming for them. And then, without warning, it came. The attack didn't come from the shadows of that dead world, as they had feared. It didn't come from some alien species, lying in wait for an opportune moment. No, it came from within, from their own. The Galactic Concord, in its wisdom, or lack thereof, had been monitoring the humans' every move. They had watched as humanity delved deeper into the mystery of the planet, hoping to uncover some hidden knowledge, some long-lost technology that could tip the scales in their favor. But what the Concord failed to understand was that the humans weren't just investigating. They were playing with forces beyond their comprehension, forces that had already consumed a world, forces that would stop at nothing to annihilate them all. When the attack came, it wasn't a direct assault. There were no ships, no weapons fired in anger. Instead, it was a subtle, insidious infiltration, a quiet coup from within the highest ranks of the Concord itself. The humans found themselves cut off, isolated, their every move scrutinized, their every communication intercepted. The truth, the message they had uncovered, was never allowed to reach the galaxy. Instead, the Concord had decided that the humans were a threat that had to be eliminated before it could spread. The war had already begun, and humanity, the very species that had reached out in peace, had been betrayed. The first sign of the war wasn't a sudden explosion or a fleet of enemy ships bearing down on the human colonies. It was far more insidious. The humans had barely begun to process the gravity of the situation when the Concord's assault came in the form of silence. Communications went dark. At first, it seemed like an accident, perhaps a technical malfunction, or some kind of anomaly with their systems. But as the hours stretched into days, the truth became undeniable. The network was being systematically shut down. In place of their usual daily reports, they received only static, a constant, suffocating hum that filled their comms like the sound of the void itself. But the most chilling sign was the messages that never came. No one from the Galactic Concord, no allies, no leaders, had reached out to explain. There were no reassurances, no responses to their frantic attempts to reach them. It was as if the universe had closed its doors, leaving humanity stranded on the precipice of a nightmare that was just beginning to unfold. What the humans didn't realize at first was that they were already under surveillance. In the dark corners of the Concord, a covert faction had been monitoring their every move. These were the factions that didn't trust humanity's ideals, the ones who saw the promise of peace not as a beacon of hope, but as a threat to the very order of the galaxy. Humanity, with its idealistic views, had stirred something primal in the hearts of those who believed in power through fear and control. They believed that the universe was a place of balance, that the strong must dominate, and that any race that dared to show weakness, even in the form of empathy, was a danger. They had already decided. Humanity's dream of peace would be its downfall. The Concord's betrayal was subtle, like a poison slowly infiltrating the bloodstream. Behind closed doors, the factions moved swiftly to erase humanity from the intergalactic stage. Ships vanished. Colonies went silent. Planets that had once welcomed human settlers turned cold, cutting off communication and declaring themselves neutral in a war they knew was coming. And within the heart of the Concord's capital, a meeting was held, a meeting that would decide the fate of every human alive. The most powerful leaders in the galaxy, those who controlled the fleets, the politics, the very laws of the universe, agreed. The war had to begin, And it would begin with the humans, for they were the catalyst, the wild card that could never be allowed to spread beyond their small corner of the stars. But the humans refused to believe it. They had always believed that peace was just a matter of time, that with understanding and collaboration, they could bridge the gaps between the races of the galaxy. They refused to see the growing tension, the subtle acts of aggression building behind closed doors. It wasn't until the first ships were destroyed that the truth became undeniable. A fleet of human ships, small in number but advanced beyond anything they had ever encountered, was en route to the heart of the galaxy. Their mission was simple: to establish diplomatic ties with the wider Concord, to share the findings of their investigation and the warning they had uncovered. They would show the galaxy what they had learned, exposing the truth of the ancient signal, revealing the cosmic horror that lurked beyond the stars. But as they crossed the outer edge of the Concord's borders, they were met by something unexpected: a wall of force. Dozens of Concord warships, silent and deadly, surrounded the human fleet, cutting off all escape routes. No communication, no demands, just the cold, unfeeling presence of an enemy that did not speak, but acted swiftly and decisively. The human fleet attempted to maneuver, to escape, to fight, but they were no match. The first strike was swift. No warning, no time for fear. The lead ship, a massive vessel designed for diplomacy and peaceful communication, was torn apart in an instant, its engines flashing in a brilliant cascade of light before disappearing into the darkness. The rest of the fleet followed shortly after, one by one, each ship disintegrating in a blaze of fire and metal. It wasn't just the destruction that stung, it was the fact that it had been deliberate, cold, calculated. The Concorde had not simply neutralized a threat, they had eradicated an idea. The idea that humanity could stand beside the stars, offering peace rather than conflict. The survivors were left adrift in the aftermath, broken, scattered, and desperate. It was only then that the true nature of the war began to show itself. This was not a war about resources or territory. This was not a war over ideology or survival. This was a war about a cosmic belief, a belief that peace was a delusion, a mistake, a weakness that had to be stamped out before it could spread. And at the center of it all was the truth that the humans had uncovered, the warning, the ancient message that had foreseen this very moment. The message that the Concorde had feared would ignite a chain reaction throughout the galaxy, a movement that would challenge everything they had built, everything they had come to believe. The humans knew the truth now. They had seen what the Concorde would never admit. The galaxy was a house of cards, held together by fear and power, and peace was a luxury no one could afford. Humanity had come too close to unraveling the fabric of that power, and so, in their eyes, they had to be removed. But the humans weren't defeated. Not yet. They had always believed that the fight for peace was worth the sacrifice, that the struggle for a better future was always worth the cost. And now, they would make their stand. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. As the survivors of the attack regrouped, a new resolve began to build among them. They would fight back, not just for survival, but for the vision they had carried to the stars. They would expose the truth of what had happened. They would show the galaxy that peace was not a weakness, that it was a strength, a force that could unite civilizations, that could overcome the darkness of the cosmos. But they knew they couldn't do it alone. The war that was coming would require allies, and in the darkest corners of the galaxy, there were those who still believed in humanity's dream of peace. But would they have the courage to stand beside them, or would the fear of the Concorde's wrath drive them into the shadows? Only time would tell. The war that followed was not one of flashy battles or heroic last stands. It was a war of shadows, a war fought in the dark corners of space, in the silence of distant worlds, where no one could hear the screams of the fallen or the cries of those who fought to preserve a dream. It was a war fought not just with weapons, but with ideals, with knowledge, and with the unyielding will of a species that refused to surrender its vision of peace. In the early days of the war, Humanity was scattered, broken. Their fleets had been decimated, their colonies cut off and isolated, their leaders hunted. The Galactic Concord had made sure that every major force capable of resistance was crippled, every hope extinguished with brutal efficiency. Entire star systems, once vibrant with human life, were now silent, their lights snuffed out as the Concord tightened its grip on the galaxy. But humanity was not without its strengths. The human spirit, that inexplicable drive to survive against all odds, had not been broken. In the wake of the initial carnage, a resistance began to form, disparate, unorganized, but determined. They were not military leaders or tacticians. They were ordinary people, scientists, engineers, civilians who had once believed in diplomacy and peace. Now they were fighting for something more, for the very survival of their ideals. It began with whispers, a message here, a rumor there. An encrypted transmission that reached the right ears, telling of hidden bunkers, of fleets waiting in the shadows, of outposts scattered across the galaxy where resistance cells were gathering. Slowly, the humans began to unite. The Concord had underestimated them. They thought that when the military might of the galaxy descended upon humanity, it would crush them beneath its boot heel. What the Concord failed to realize was that humanity's greatest weapon was not its ships, its technology, or its weapons. It was their unrelenting belief that peace was possible. In the shadows of war, a new kind of army was born, one that didn't fight with weapons of mass destruction, but with the mind. Engineers and scientists began to salvage what was left of humanity's lost fleets, rebuilding the ships and weapons of war from the wreckage of their own fallen vessels. But their true weapon, the one that would turn the tide of the war, was something far more dangerous, something the Concord could never have anticipated. The humans, in their desperate search for answers, had uncovered an ancient technology on that dead world, the one that had sent the original warning. It was an artifact, small, unassuming, and buried beneath layers of the planet's scorched surface. When the human explorers had first found it, they had thought it a relic of the ancient civilization that once called this world home. But what they soon discovered was that it was far more than that. It was a key to something much larger, something cosmic and incomprehensible. The artifact was a form of communication, one that transcended the limits of normal space-time. It was a signal, yes, but not in the conventional sense. This signal had the power to manipulate the very fabric of reality, to breach the boundaries of the known universe and tap into something beyond comprehension. It could reach across time and space, piercing the walls of existence like a blade cutting through the void. The humans, in their pursuit of peace, had inadvertently uncovered a technology that could rewrite the rules of warfare itself. They began to study it, to unravel its mysteries, and soon they realized that the artifact was far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. It was not just a means of communication. It was a weapon capable of altering the very fabric of the universe, a weapon that could change the course of time itself. But it was also dangerous, unstable. The knowledge contained within it was beyond anything humanity had ever encountered. The artifact was a relic of an ancient civilization that had long since perished, its creators destroyed by the very forces they had sought to control. The Concord knew this, of course. They had always known. And when the humans began to tap into the artifact's power, the Concord moved quickly to eliminate the threat. They dispatched their most formidable fleet to track down the humans and seize the artifact for themselves. But the humans had already learned to use the artifact in ways the Concord couldn't understand. It was not just a weapon. It was a tool, a key to unlocking the deepest mysteries of the cosmos. With it, the humans could manipulate the very essence of reality itself. They could shift the tides of time, alter the course of events, and most terrifying of all, peer into the hidden depths of the universe. And they began to do so. They used the artifact to send signals across vast distances, to manipulate the space-time continuum, to distort the very fabric of the galaxy. They tapped into the hidden knowledge of the universe, learning secrets that no one had ever meant for them to uncover. And with this newfound power, they struck back. The first major counterattack came not in the form of a military assault, but in a disruption of the Concorde's most secure communications. Using the artifact, the humans managed to infiltrate the heart of the Concorde's military network, causing chaos and confusion on a scale never before seen. Messages were intercepted, fleets redirected, and entire fleets of Concorde warships were sent into the farthest reaches of the galaxy on wild goose chases. It was the beginning of a new phase of the war, one where humanity fought not with force, but with intelligence, with ingenuity, and with the knowledge they had gained from the ancient artifact. The Concorde, initially confident in their power, were now forced to respond in ways they had never anticipated. They sent their fleets to hunt down the human resistance, but each time they were outmaneuvered. The humans had learned how to predict their movements, how to alter the very fabric of space to their advantage. And then, just when it seemed that humanity might gain the upper hand, the unimaginable happened. The artifact began to change. It began to evolve. The power within it, once a tool for communication, began to warp and distort, becoming something far more dangerous. The humans had unlocked a doorway, but they hadn't known what lay on the other side. And now, that doorway was opening. It was a cosmic horror that no one could have predicted. What humanity had tapped into was not just a weapon. It was a connection to something far older, far more powerful. The artifact was not just a relic of a long-dead race. It was a beacon, a call to something far beyond the galaxy, something that had been waiting, dormant, for eons. And now, it was awakening. The humans were no longer fighting just for their survival. They were fighting to contain a force beyond comprehension, a force that, if unleashed, could destroy not just the Concorde, but the entire galaxy. As the artifact's power continued to grow, the humans found themselves walking a razor-thin line between salvation and annihilation. The very nature of the artifact had begun to shift in ways no one could fully understand. It was as if it had a mind of its own, a consciousness that transcended the limits of mere technology. It pulsed with a strange, almost sentient rhythm, like the heartbeat of an ancient, slumbering god finally waking from its eternal rest. And the more the humans sought to control it, the more it seemed to slip further from their grasp. With each passing day, they discovered new capabilities, terrifying, mind-bending abilities that defied all understanding of science, physics, and even the laws of reality itself. They were able to manipulate the fabric of space-time, bending and twisting the very dimensions of existence to their will. But they could never predict the consequences. A simple alteration to a distant star's trajectory, meant to shift its orbit and perhaps alter the course of a fleet's attack, could send shockwaves rippling through the very structure of the universe, triggering a cascade of events that no one could foresee. A seemingly small mistake, a minor miscalculation, could open a rift in space, tearing apart entire systems or distorting the timeline itself. The artifact was far beyond anything humanity had ever created, and it was beginning to reveal its true, terrifying potential. It was not a weapon of destruction alone. It was a conduit to a far darker and deeper truth. The Concorde, now fully aware of the magnitude of what they were facing, deployed their most elite forces to track down the humans and destroy the artifact. They understood that the consequences of allowing such a force to remain in human hands could mean not just the end of the war, but the end of their entire control over the galaxy. But the humans weren't just trying to survive anymore, they were trying to understand. They needed to know why the artifact was reacting the way it was. They needed to know its purpose, its origin, and above all, what it was calling to. It was not simply a relic of a long-dead civilization. It was something far more ancient, something that had been hidden, buried, for reasons they couldn't yet comprehend. They turned to the only source of answers they could find, the remnants of the ancient civilization that had created the artifact. Through painstaking research and increasingly risky missions, the humans uncovered more fragments of their history. They learned that this race, long gone, had once been among the most powerful in the galaxy. They had achieved feats that now seemed impossible, bending the very fabric of the universe to their will. But it hadn't come without a cost. Their hubris had led them to believe that they could control the forces of the cosmos, forces that, in their arrogance, they had underestimated. In the end, the civilization had paid the price for their mistakes. The very powers they had harnessed had turned against them, ravaging their worlds, destroying their species, and leaving only fragments behind. Fragments that humanity was now beginning to uncover. As the humans delved deeper into these discoveries, they came to realize something horrifying. The artifact was not a weapon at all. It was a trap, a prison, a containment device designed to hold something that had been locked away for eternity. The artifact was not simply a tool for communication or a weapon to be wielded. It was the key to unleashing an entity so powerful, so incomprehensible, that it could unravel the very fabric of reality itself. This entity, the humans discovered, was ancient beyond measure, older than the galaxy, older than time itself. It was not bound by the laws of physics or reality. It was a creature of chaos, a force of nature that existed in the spaces between the stars, in the gaps between moments in time. It had been sealed away by the civilization that had created the artifact, imprisoned in a prison of their own making, hidden deep in the fabric of space. But the artifact, the very thing humanity had thought to use for their own advantage, was the key to its release. And now, with each new use of the artifact, the humans were unwittingly unlocking the door to that prison. The entity had been stirring, awakening, its influence spreading like a shadow across the galaxy. It was a creature of darkness, a being so powerful that even the combined forces of the Concord could not fathom its true extent. And as the humans continued to use the artifact, the entity's reach grew. The first signs of its awakening were subtle. It began with a series of strange phenomena: distortions in space, disruptions in time, unexplained gravitational anomalies. Entire star systems began to flicker in and out of existence, as if reality itself was bending under the strain. And then came the whispers. They were faint at first, barely perceptible. Distorted voices that seemed to echo from the depths of space, as if the very fabric of the universe was speaking to them. At first, the humans thought it was just a side effect of the artifact's power. They didn't realize what they were dealing with. But soon, the whispers grew louder, clearer, and they began to speak directly to them. "You are the key," the voice whispered, its tone cold and ancient. "You have unlocked the door. Now you will witness what lies beyond it." It was not a warning. It was an invitation. And then the war took a turn no one could have predicted. The Concord, in their desperation to stop the humans, had begun to mobilize their most advanced fleets. They knew that humanity was no longer just a threat. They were a catalyst, a force that could tear apart the very fabric of the galaxy. They made their move, sending their most formidable warships to eliminate humanity once and for all. But what they didn't know was that they were not the only ones moving. The entity, whatever it was, whatever it had once been, had begun to awaken in full force, and it was not going to let anyone stop it. The Concord's fleets, powerful as they were, stood no chance against what was coming. The humans had been the unwitting heralds of the greatest cosmic horror the galaxy had ever known. The entity had begun to reach out with its tendrils, bending time and space to its will. The war was no longer about humanity's survival. It was no longer about the Concord or their desire for control. It was about something far greater, a cosmic reckoning that was about to unfold. The galaxy, as they knew it, was about to change forever. The entity's awakening was no longer a distant threat. It was now a palpable presence in the galaxy. Its influence spread like a plague, seeping into the very fabric of space and time, warping reality in ways that were both incomprehensible and terrifying. Stars flickered out of existence as if snuffed by an invisible hand, while entire solar systems began to collapse inward, their gravitational fields torn apart by forces far beyond anything the Concord or the humans had ever encountered. What had once been a war for survival had now become a race against time to contain something far worse than anything anyone had ever imagined. Humanity, in their desperate bid for survival, had unknowingly opened the door to a cosmic force that transcended the boundaries of known physics. The very nature of the entity itself was beyond human understanding. It was not a creature of flesh and bone, but a force, a being that existed outside the constraints of time, space, and reality. It had no physical form, no recognizable shape. It was an idea, a presence that reached into the minds of those who encountered it, bending their perceptions, twisting their understanding of the universe into something unrecognizable. For the humans who had uncovered the artifact, the consequences were immediate and horrifying. They had unknowingly become conduits for the entity's power, its influence growing stronger with every use of the artifact. The artifact, once thought to be a tool for communication and manipulation, had become a tether, linking humanity directly to the entity, pulling them ever closer to its grip. As the entity's power grew, so too did its ability to manipulate the minds of those who encountered it. The whispers, once faint and distant, were now deafening. They filled the minds of the humans, pouring into their thoughts like a river of chaos. At first, it was subtle. A thought here, a suggestion there. But soon, the whispers began to take control, twisting the minds of those who had once been resolute in their quest for peace. Their ideals, their hopes, their dreams, all of it began to unravel in the face of the entity's overwhelming presence. They were no longer the peaceful beings they had once been. The entity had infected them, slowly eroding their humanity. Its whispers became commands, urging them to act, to move toward the inevitable. They began to see visions, visions of destruction, of worlds burning, of civilizations falling into chaos. But what truly terrified them was the realization that these were not just visions. They were glimpses of the future, glimpses of what was to come if the entity was allowed to fully awaken. The resistance, once the last hope for human survival, was now on the brink of collapse. The humans who had once fought with the ideals of peace and unity now found themselves divided. Some sought to harness the power of the artifact, believing that they could control it and use it to defeat the Concord and the entity itself. Others, seeing the true horror of what they had uncovered, desperately sought to destroy the artifact, to seal away its power before it could spread any further. But the Concord, too, was changing. They had long prided themselves on their discipline and control, but they were not immune to the entity's influence. As their fleets moved toward the human colonies, they too began to feel the pull of the whispers. It started with their leaders, the high-ranking officers and generals who had once been the epitome of cold, calculating logic. They began to make strange decisions, ones that defied all military strategy and reason. Entire fleets disappeared without a trace, swallowed by the entity's influence. Their soldiers, once loyal to the Concord cause, began to question their purpose, their motivations, their very identities. What had once been a unified and formidable force was now splintering, just as humanity had splintered. Both sides were losing their grip on reality, slipping further into the abyss as the entity's presence grew ever stronger. And then, as if answering an unspoken call, the true horror of the entity's power was revealed. A rift in space, a tear in the very fabric of reality itself, opened up, and from it emerged something that could only be described as a cosmic manifestation of destruction. It was not a ship, nor a fleet of warships, but a living, breathing entity of pure chaos. It was the entity's true form, something that had been locked away for eons, now unleashed upon the galaxy. This was the true face of the entity, an entity that was both vast and minuscule, a presence that spanned the infinite expanse of space, and yet existed on a scale so small that it could collapse entire dimensions in the blink of an eye. It had no shape, no recognizable structure. It was pure energy, a swirling mass of light and darkness, constantly shifting and changing, twisting space and time around it, as if the very laws of physics bent to its will. The human resistance, now fractured and divided, could only watch in horror as the entity moved across the galaxy, its presence consuming everything in its path. The Concorde's fleets, which had once seemed unstoppable, were now little more than helpless prey, torn apart by the entity's immense power. Planets, once thriving with life, were reduced to rubble in an instant, their moons shattered, their surfaces scorched. The very fabric of the galaxy was being torn apart, its foundations collapsing as the entity's power reached out across the stars. And through it all, the humans, caught between their desperation to stop the entity and their own growing madness, continued to struggle. Some sought to use the artifact to control the entity, believing that they could harness its power and bend it to their will. Others, those who still clung to the ideals of peace, fought to destroy the artifact, to end the madness before it consumed them all. But as the entity's influence spread, they began to realize something far more chilling. There was no stopping it. It was not just a force of destruction, but a force of inevitable entropy. It was a being that existed outside of time, beyond the comprehension of any civilization. It had no end, no limit, no boundaries. Its power was not something that could be contained or controlled. It was something that could only be endured or succumbed to. As the war raged on, the question loomed larger than ever. Was there any way to stop the entity, or was the galaxy doomed to fall into the abyss of its influence? Were the humans, in their search for peace, the unwitting catalysts of their own destruction? And was there any hope left for a universe so ravaged by the chaos that had been unleashed? The answers seemed increasingly distant as the fabric of reality itself began to unravel, and the final terrifying truth began to take shape. This was not just the end of a war. This was the end of everything. The galaxy, once a vibrant mosaic of civilizations, now existed in a state of fractured chaos. Star systems that had been home to countless species, human, alien, and others, had become nothing more than ghostly remnants, their planets reduced to barren, lifeless rocks, their inhabitants swept away by the tides of a war that had grown beyond anyone's ability to control. The very stars themselves seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as if they too were succumbing to the overwhelming influence of the entity that had been unleashed. Humanity, caught in the web of their own creation, was now teetering on the brink of annihilation. The resistance, what little remained of it, was fractured into factions, some clinging to the hope that the artifact could still be used to stop the entity, others desperate to destroy it, knowing that their very existence was tied to its malevolent influence. Every decision, every movement, seemed to carry the weight of the universe on its shoulders, and every choice led them closer to the abyss. The Concorde, too, had been irrevocably altered by the entity's presence. Their once dominant military forces, once thought invincible, were now scattered and broken. The leadership, once sharp and resolute, had descended into madness. Each commander and officer caught in the throes of the whispers that had once plagued the humans. They were no longer the cold, calculating force they had once been. They were pawns in a game they could not understand, moving blindly, desperately trying to maintain control over a galaxy that was slipping from their grasp. But the true horror had yet to be realized. In their desperation, both the humans and the Concorde had made a critical error, one that would prove to be their undoing. In their attempts to control or destroy the artifact, they had unknowingly awakened something far more dangerous than the entity itself, something that had been hidden within the artifact, lying dormant for eons. It was not just the entity that had been sealed away within the artifact. The true purpose of the artifact was not to contain the entity, but to guard it, to protect it from those who would seek to unleash it. And in their attempts to harness its power, the humans had inadvertently triggered a chain reaction that had not only freed the entity, but had also awakened the ancient guardians that had once protected it. These guardians were not physical beings, nor were they constructed of flesh and blood. They were something far older, ancient, transcendent entities that existed outside the boundaries of space and time. They were sentient beings of pure energy, woven into the very fabric of the universe itself. They had no form, no shape, but their presence was undeniable. They were the architects of reality, the custodians of the cosmic balance, and their purpose was to ensure that the entity remained sealed away forever. For millennia, they had watched over the galaxy, their influence felt in the ebb and flow of the universe's natural order. But the moment the artifact had been disturbed, the moment the entity had begun to stir, they had awakened. And now, they were coming for humanity. They were coming for the Concord, and they were coming for everything. The first signs of their arrival were subtle, barely noticeable at first. A ripple in the fabric of space, a strange distortion in the time continuum. But as their presence grew stronger, so too did the magnitude of the destruction they wrought. Entire systems began to disappear, not in the chaotic explosions of war, but in a quiet, eerie stillness. Stars blinked out of existence without a sound, their energy consumed by an unknown force, swallowed whole by the Guardian's approach. It was not just the material world that was being erased. The very concepts of time and space began to twist and warp under the influence of these ancient beings. Time itself no longer moved in a straight line. It folded in on itself, bending and twisting, creating paradoxes that could not be explained by any known science. Events that had occurred in the past were suddenly altered, shifting the course of history in ways no one could comprehend. Futures that had once seemed set in stone were now in flux, constantly changing as the fabric of reality was torn apart and remade by the will of the Guardians. For the humans, it was an unthinkable horror. They had always known that they were at the mercy of the universe's mysteries, but they had never imagined something like this. They had fought to survive against the Concord, against each other, but now they faced something that was beyond their comprehension. The entity, once thought to be their greatest threat, was now the least of their concerns. The true danger was not the chaos the entity could create. It was the ancient Guardians, whose presence heralded the unraveling of the entire galaxy. The Concord, for all their might, were no better equipped to face this new threat. Their advanced technology, their vast fleets, were nothing more than toys in the hands of the Guardians. The very ships that had once been the pride of the Concord military now disintegrated under the weight of an invisible force. Their weapons, once capable of tearing apart entire fleets, were rendered useless, their energy dissipating into nothingness as the Guardians wove their destructive patterns through the fabric of space. And yet, amidst the growing despair, there was a flicker of hope, a realization that had begun to dawn on the humans. If they could not stop the Guardians, if they could not control the artifact, then perhaps the only way to save the galaxy was to break the cycle entirely. To destroy the artifact, to sever the connection between the entity and the Guardians, to erase the very possibility of their influence once and for all. But how could they destroy something so ancient, so deeply embedded in the fabric of the universe itself? How could they destroy a force that had existed since before time, a force that had shaped the very nature of existence? It was a question that gnawed at the edges of their minds, even as the galaxy around them burned. They were running out of time. The Guardians were drawing closer, their power growing with each passing moment. The fabric of space was unraveling, the universe itself falling apart at the seams. Soon, there would be nothing left. No galaxy, no civilizations, no stars, just the empty, endless void. And in that void, the entity would be free. The entity, the force that had never truly been contained, the force that existed outside of time and space, the force that had once been the architects of chaos, now ready to reshape the universe according to its will. The final question lingered in the air like a dark cloud. Could anyone survive what was to come? Could the universe ever be restored? Or was this the beginning of an end that could never be undone? The end was no longer a distant possibility. It was here, now, unfolding before their eyes. The universe, the very fabric of existence itself, had begun to fray at the edges, unraveling in a slow, inevitable collapse. Time and space were no longer stable. The laws that had once governed the cosmos were now mere illusions, fading into nothingness as the true power of the Guardians and the entity coursed through the galaxy. Everywhere the humans looked, they saw nothing but chaos. The stars that had once guided them, symbols of hope and progress, were now cold and distant, their light flickering as if even they were losing the will to burn. Worlds, once teeming with life and possibility, had been reduced to lifeless husks, the remnants of civilizations long gone. The space between the stars seemed to warp and twist, contorting into shapes that defied logic, as if the very concept of distance was no longer a reliable measure of the universe. The resistance, what was left of it, had gathered on the ruins of a once thriving human colony, a place now reduced to nothing but shattered buildings and abandoned streets. The planet, once rich in resources and culture, was now a ghost world, its surface scarred by the remnants of failed attempts to fight back against the inevitable. They were the last remnants of humanity's struggle, the few who still clung to the hope that there was some way to stop this catastrophe, some way to avert the total destruction that loomed on the horizon. But as the Guardians drew nearer, as the very fabric of existence seemed to twist in response to their presence, the humans understood something undeniable. There was no stopping them. The Guardians were not merely a force to be reckoned with. They were the embodiment of the universe's will, an ancient power that had existed long before the first stars had burned into existence. The very nature of reality itself was shifting, and with it, their ability to resist had evaporated. Yet, in their final moments, as their world fell apart around them, the humans began to question everything. Had this end been inevitable from the start? Had the pursuit of peace, their unyielding belief that diplomacy could save them, been their ultimate downfall? They had always believed in the power of unity, that the strength of their combined ideals could overcome any obstacle. But the entity, the Guardians, had shown them a horrifying truth. The universe was not a place where peace reigned. It was a place of balance, of chaos and order, of forces far beyond their understanding. They were insignificant in the grand design, mere pawns in a game that had been played for eons. In the final hours, some within the resistance chose to take drastic action. They had discovered an anomaly in the fabric of reality, an unstable rift created by the entity's presence that could theoretically be used to disrupt the flow of time and space itself. It was a long shot, a final gambit, but it was the only hope they had left. If they could activate the rift, they might be able to reverse the events that had led them to this point, to undo the awakening of the entity and the Guardians, to sever the connection that had caused the universe to collapse. But as they prepared for the final desperate assault on the artifact that had sparked it all, they realized something even more terrifying. The entity had not just been watching them, it had been manipulating them. The rift they had discovered, the one they had hoped would be their salvation, was not a chance for redemption. It was a trap, one set long ago, woven into the fabric of the universe itself by the Guardians. It was never meant to be used as a tool of salvation. It was a mechanism for the entity to feed. And then, in a single moment of horrifying clarity, they understood the truth. The entity was not a force to be defeated. It was a force that had existed since the dawn of time, a force that fed on the very existence of the universe. It was not a being that sought to conquer, it sought to consume, to devour the galaxy, to erase all of creation and remake it in its image. The Guardians, the very entities they had once believed were protectors, were nothing more than the gatekeepers, the custodians of an inevitable cycle of destruction. They had never sought to save the galaxy. They had merely kept the entity locked away for eons, waiting for the day when it would be free. In that moment, the humans realized that they were not the first to face this end. Every civilization before them, every species that had ever risen to prominence in the galaxy, had faced the same fate. They had all believed they could stop the entity, all believed they could control the artifact, all believed they could change the course of the universe. But every time, without fail, the entity had won. It had consumed everything in its path, erasing entire galaxies, devouring civilizations, until nothing was left but a void. Now it was humanity's turn. Their civilization would be just another in a long line of fallen empires, another forgotten footnote in the history of the cosmos. They would not be remembered. They would be erased. And yet, as they prepared to face their inevitable extinction, there was a strange, almost defiant sense of clarity among them. They had failed. They had been too weak, too divided, too arrogant to see the truth until it was too late. But in their final moments, they understood that it was not the entity's victory that mattered. It was the realization that they had fought, that they had struggled for something greater than themselves. Even in the face of overwhelming darkness, they had sought peace. They had tried to change the universe, to reshape it into something better. And though they would never see that vision realized, the memory of their fight, their resilience, would live on in the hearts of those who would come after them. As the Guardians closed in, as the rift began to pull apart the very fabric of existence, the humans made their final stand. They had fought not for victory, but for the memory of a time when peace had been possible, when hope had not yet been extinguished. They fought for a future that would never come, for a world that had already been lost. And as the entity consumed them, as the Guardians carried out their unholy task of erasing the galaxy from existence, the final question echoed through the void. Was it all worth it? Was the pursuit of peace, the refusal to submit to the chaos of the universe, the right choice? Or had they simply been too naive to accept the truth of their place in the cosmos? And as the universe itself began to collapse, the question remained unanswered, leaving only the emptiness to witness the final, tragic chapter of humanity's story. Yet, in their final moments, as their world fell apart around them, the humans began to question everything. Had this end been inevitable from the start? Had the pursuit of peace, their unyielding belief that diplomacy could save them, been their ultimate downfall? They had always believed in the power of unity, that the strength of their combined ideals could overcome any obstacle. But the entity, the Guardians, had shown them a horrifying truth. The universe was not a place where peace reigned. It was a place of balance, of chaos and order, of forces far beyond their understanding. They were insignificant in the grand design, mere pawns in a game that had been played for eons. In the final hours, some within the resistance chose to take drastic action. They had discovered an anomaly in the fabric of reality, an unstable rift created by the entity's presence that could theoretically be used to disrupt the flow of time and space itself. It was a long shot, a final gambit, but it was the only hope they had left. If they could activate the rift, they might be able to reverse the events that had led them to this point, to undo the awakening of the entity and the Guardians, to sever the connection that had caused the universe to collapse. But as they prepared for the final, desperate assault on the artifact that had sparked it all, they realized something even more terrifying. The entity had not just been watching them, it had been manipulating them. The rift they had discovered, the one they had hoped would be their salvation, was not a chance for redemption. It was a trap, one set long ago, woven into the fabric of the universe itself by the Guardians. It was never meant to be used as a tool of salvation. It was a mechanism for the entity to feed. And then, in a single moment of horrifying clarity, they understood the truth. The entity was not a force to be defeated. It was a force that had existed since the dawn of time, a force that fed on the very existence of the universe. It was not a being that sought to conquer. It sought to consume, to devour the galaxy, to erase all of creation and remake it in its image. The Guardians, the very entities they had once believed were protectors, were nothing more than the gatekeepers, the custodians of an inevitable cycle of destruction. They had never sought to save the galaxy. They had merely kept the entity locked away for eons, waiting for the day when it would be free. In that moment, the humans realized that they were not the first to face this end. Every civilization before them, every species that had ever risen to prominence in the galaxy, had faced the same fate. They had all believed they could stop the entity, all believed they could control the artifact, all believed they could change the course of the universe. But every time, without fail, the entity had won. It had consumed everything in its path, erasing entire galaxies, devouring civilizations, until nothing was left but a void. Now, it was humanity's turn. Their civilization would be just another in a long line of fallen empires, another forgotten footnote in the history of the cosmos. They would not be remembered. They would be erased. And yet, as they prepared to face their inevitable extinction, there was a strange, almost defiant sense of clarity among them. They had failed. They had been too weak, too divided, too arrogant to see the truth until it was too late. But in their final moments, they understood that it was not the entity's victory that mattered. It was the realization that they had fought, that they had struggled for something greater than themselves. Even in the face of overwhelming darkness, they had sought peace. They had tried to change the universe, to reshape it into something better. And though they would never see that vision realized, the memory of their fight, their resilience, would live on in the hearts of those who would come after them. As the Guardians closed in, as the rift began to pull apart the very fabric of existence, the humans made their final stand. They fought not for victory, but for the memory of a time when peace had been possible, when hope had not yet been extinguished. They fought for a future that would never come, for a world that had already been lost. And as the entity consumed them, as the Guardians carried out their unholy task of erasing the galaxy from existence, the final question echoed through the void. Was it all worth it? Was the pursuit of peace, the refusal to submit to the chaos of the universe, the right choice? Or had they simply been too naive to accept the truth of their place in the cosmos? And as the universe itself began to collapse, the question remained unanswered, leaving only the emptiness to witness the final, tragic chapter of humanity's story.